I stayed in that theater seat for a long time after the phone stopped ringing. The credits had finished. The screen had gone dark. The only light in the room was the cold blue glow from Chloe's phone still face up on the armrest between us. The name on the screen sitting there, like something that had been waiting its whole life to arrive at the worst possible moment. 5 letters. Donna. My mama's name on my girlfriend's phone at 10:47 on a Friday night in a Nashville movie theater, and there was only one human being on earth who could have made that happen. Chloe had not moved. She was watching me with that expression she had, the one with nothing managed in it, present and still and waiting without any pressure attached to the waiting. She had seen my face change when I read the screen. She was giving me whatever time the moment required. That quality of hers, the ability to be in a hard moment without trying to move it along, was something I had come to understand as one of the most generous things about her. And right then, it was the only thing keeping me from the kind of panic that makes you say things you have to walk back later. I picked up her phone. I looked at the screen. The call had ended while I was looking at it. In its place was a notification showing one missed call from a contact saved as Donna, and below it, visible in the preview before the phone locked, the beginning of a text that had come in while the call was ringing. Chloe, this is Maya's mother. I got your number from... The screen went dark before I could read the rest. I did not need to read the rest. The architecture of what Ryan had done arranged itself in my head with the cold clarity of a spreadsheet, every cell in its correct position. He had planned this, not impulsively, not in a moment of anger, but with the patient, deliberate calculation that I had spent 2 years mistaking for stability. He had found Chloe's number, which was not hard because her Instagram was public, and her contact information was in the bio for her art inquiries, and he had passed it to my mama with enough context to make the call seem like concern rather than interference. He had waited for the right moment. He had a gift for waiting for the right moment. I set the phone down between us and looked at the dark screen in front of me for a long breath. Then I looked at Chloe. She was watching me with those eyes of hers that always saw more than I showed her. And this time I did not try to show her less than there was. I said, "That was my mother." She said, "I figured." I said, "Ryan gave her your number." She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Okay." Not surprised, not angry on the surface, just receiving the information and making space for whatever needed to come next. I told her I needed to call Donna back. Not because I owed Ryan the satisfaction of the disruption he had engineered, but because leaving my mama's call unanswered was its own kind of choice, and not one I was willing to make. Chloe nodded and shifted slightly in her seat, giving me the physical equivalent of privacy while remaining exactly where she was. I picked up my own phone from my bag, found Donna in my contacts, and pressed call. She answered on the first ring, which meant she had been holding her phone. Her voice was different from the versions of her voice I was used to. Not the warm Sunday morning voice, not the concerned Monday phone call voice. This was a version of Donna I did not hear often, quieter, more uncertain. The voice she used when she had done something and was already not entirely sure she should have done it. "Maya, baby," she said. I said, "Mama, why do you have her number?" The silence that followed was long enough to tell me everything about the state of her certainty. She said Ryan had called her that afternoon. She said he had told her he was worried about me, that I was spending a lot of time with someone she had never met, that he thought she should reach out. She said she had not thought it through before she called. The last part was honest in a way that I recognized as genuinely Donna rather than strategic Donna, and it was that honesty that kept my voice even when I responded. I told her that what Ryan had done was give her a private person's contact information as a tool to manage me, and that the fact that it had been dressed up as concern did not change what it was. I told her I was fine, that I was with someone I trusted, and that we would talk more, but not tonight. She said, "I hear you, baby." I said goodnight. I hung up. The theater was completely quiet around us. The Regal Cinema at Opry Mills after the last showing of the night had a specific quality of silence, the particular emptiness of a large purpose-built space in the absence of its purpose, and it pressed in from the walls in a way that made the two of us feel both very small and very close. Chloe reached over and turned her phone face down on the armrest without looking at it. Then she looked at me. "Are you okay?" she asked. Not as a formality, as a real question with real interest in the real answer. I thought about it for a moment, which was something she had taught me to do, to actually consider the question rather than respond to it with whatever answer was socially expected. "I will be," I said. "Right now, I'm a little bit furious, and also relieved that I answered it instead of letting it sit." She nodded slowly. "Both of those make sense," she said. That was Chloe. No hierarchy of feelings. Everything allowed to exist at its actual size. We sat in those seats for a long time after that. We did not talk about Ryan. We did not talk about Donna. We sat in the dark of the empty theater with the armrest between us and the Nashville night happening outside the walls, and the particular kind of quiet that I had come to associate with being in her presence. Not the quiet of nothing to say, but the quiet of everything already understood. At some point she reached over and took my hand in the dark, and I felt the warmth of it move all the way up my arm and settle somewhere in the center of my chest. We left the theater together when the cleaning crew came through, walking out into the Opry Mills Mall corridor with its post-closing quiet, the stores dark behind their grates, and the overhead lights dim to their nighttime setting, and our footsteps the only sound on the polished floor, all the way to the parking lot exit. Outside, the Nashville night was still warm the way it stays warm in late summer, the air carrying that particular mixture of humidity and something green that I had grown up breathing and only recently started consciously appreciating. She walked with me to my car. We stood in the parking lot in the amber glow of the overhead lights, and she looked at me for a long moment. She said, "Whatever he does next, you already know what you know." I looked at her standing there in the parking lot light and thought about what it meant to have someone say the right thing without being told what the right thing was. I said, "I know." She said, "Good." She squeezed my hand once and let go, and walked back toward the cinema entrance to get her bag and clock out. I stood by my car for a moment, watching her go and understanding, with a clarity that had nothing tentative left in it, that I was not going to let anyone's interference move me 1 inch from where I had arrived. I drove home from the Opry Mills Mall that night on a route I had taken 1,000 times, down Briley Parkway and up Charlotte Pike with the windows down and the Nashville late summer air coming in warm and moving through the car. And somewhere on that familiar drive, I made a decision that had actually been made for a while and was just waiting for the right moment to be acknowledged. I was done managing this situation from a defensive position. Ryan had made a move. My mama had been pulled into it with the best of intentions and the worst of timing. I had spent enough of my life being reactive to the things other people set in motion. It was time to be the one who set something in motion for once. I texted Ryan the next morning at 8:45, before I had time to talk myself into softening it. "What you did last night was unacceptable. You passed someone's private contact information to my mother without consent, and used her to get to me. I need you to understand that this is finished, Ryan. Not a break. Not a season of reflection. Finished. Do not contact me or anyone connected to me again." I put the phone down and made coffee and stood at my kitchen window watching Charlotte Pike wake up in the Saturday morning light and waited to feel regret. I did not feel regret. He responded 40 minutes later with a message that was long and carefully constructed. The kind of message that takes 40 minutes to write because every word is placed for effect rather than honesty. He said he was only trying to help. He said he was worried about the choices I was making. He said my family deserved to understand what was happening in my life. He used the phrase, "people who love you" 3 times in 8 sentences, which was 2 times more than necessary, and 1 time more than believable. I read it once, completely, which was more than it deserved, and did not respond. Donna called at 10 that morning. This time her voice was fully itself, the real version, not the uncertain version from the night before. She had clearly slept on the Ryan situation and arrived at a conclusion that I had not entirely expected. She said, "I owe you an apology, Maya. He called me and I picked up and I let him use me and I should have known better." I sat down on my couch when she said that, not because it was shocking, but because hearing Donna use the word use about Ryan was a thing I had not been sure she was capable of arriving at, and it hit with a weight I needed to be sitting down for. I told her the apology was accepted and that I understood she had not known what she was walking into. She said, "I have been thinking about what you told me at lunch, about the clothes and the location and all of it. I have been thinking about it a lot, baby." I said I was glad she had been thinking about it. She said, "I want to meet her properly, not the way last night was. I want to sit down and have a meal like people do." I was quiet for a moment. Then I said I would ask and let her know. She said that was all she needed and that she loved me, and we hung up. I texted Chloe immediately. "My mama just called to apologize and asked to meet you properly. No pressure, on your timeline entirely." Chloe read it and took 6 minutes to respond, which for someone who usually replied in under 2 meant she was actually thinking about it rather than reacting. Her response said, "I would like that, when you think the time is right." Simple and open, and exactly her. The following week was the week Ryan went fully quiet again. That strategic silence I had learned to read as preparation rather than retreat. I did not fill the silence with anxiety the way I had before. I had other things to fill the space with. Chloe's morning's texts that arrived with the reliability of the Nashville sunrise. Long evenings on her Holly Street apartment steps watching East Nashville settle into fall. Jamie's relentless commentary on everything and everyone, delivered at a volume and pace that left no room for the kind of quiet in which worry grows. On a Wednesday afternoon, I was sitting at my work desk on my lunch break, staring at a quarterly report I had been looking at for 20 minutes without seeing, when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I did not have saved. It took me 3 seconds to understand who it was from. The message said, "I think we should talk, in person. One conversation, Maya. That is all I am asking." No name. He had switched numbers. The careful patience of it, the willingness to create a new number rather than accept that the conversation was over, was the clearest confirmation I had ever received of everything Chloe had said about people who do not disappear, but reposition. I showed Chloe the message that evening on the Holly Street steps. She read it, and handed my phone back to me, and looked at the street for a moment. Then she said, "He is going to keep finding new angles until the angle stops working. The angle stops working when you stop being available to it." I thought about that. I said, "So I just do not respond." She said, "You just do not respond." It sounded simple the way she said it. It was simple. I had been making it complicated by treating every move he made as something that required a counter-move. The counter-move was stillness. I blocked the new number and put my phone in my jacket pocket, and felt something settle in my chest, like a last piece of furniture finding its permanent position in a room. That Saturday, Chloe had the day off, and we went to Centennial Park in the late morning when the Nashville September heat was still manageable, and the park had that particular weekend quality of a city using its green space with intention. We found a spot under a large oak tree near the Parthenon, and spread a blanket that Chloe had brought in her bag, along with her sketchbook, and 2 coffees in a thermos, and a paper bag from a bakery on Gallatin that she had stopped at on her way to meet me. We sat under that oak tree for 3 hours. She drew. I read. We talked in the easy, interrupted way of people who have learned each other's rhythms, starting sentences, letting them sit, picking them up again later. At some point she showed me what she had been drawing. It was the park, wide and loose, the Parthenon visible in the background, and in the foreground the space under the oak tree with 2 figures on a blanket, one cross-legged with a book, one lying on her stomach with a pencil. She had drawn us from the outside while sitting inside the moment, which seemed to me like a completely impossible and entirely Chloe thing to do. I looked at that drawing and then looked at her and said, "You drew this while it was happening?" She said, "I always draw things while they are happening. That is how you keep them." I thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. Walking back to where I had parked on West End Avenue, she stopped at a corner and looked at me with that direct expression she had when something was forming that she was deciding whether to say. She said, "I have been thinking about the gallery thing." I waited. She said that a small gallery in the Gulch neighborhood had reached out through her Instagram about a possible show, a small group exhibition of local emerging artists, and she had been sitting on the message for a week without responding, because sitting on things was what she did when they felt too important to handle quickly. She said it with the careful containment of someone protecting a thing they want very much, but are afraid to want too openly. I stopped walking. I turned and looked at her standing there on the West End Avenue sidewalk in the September afternoon light and said, "Chloe, answer the message." She looked at me for a moment. Then that uncontained smile appeared, the one she never managed to hold back when it was genuine, and which I had decided privately was one of the most beautiful things I had ever seen on another person's face. She took her phone out of her jacket pocket right there on the sidewalk and started typing. I stood beside her and watched her do it, and felt something in my chest that was so straightforward and so enormous that I had to look away at the Nashville street for a moment to let it find its proper size. She sent the message. She put her phone away. She looked at me and said, "Okay." I said, "Okay." We kept walking. The Nashville afternoon was golden around us the way it gets in September when the angle of the light starts its seasonal shift, and the city was doing what cities do when you are happy in them, which is simply continue being itself, indifferent and perfect. The days after Chloe sent that message to the gallery had a particular quality to them, the quality of something good that has been set in motion and is now moving at its own pace regardless of how many times you check on it. She did not hear back immediately. She checked her Instagram messages with a casualness that fooled neither of us, and then put her phone away with the studied indifference of someone who has decided not to want something too visibly in case the wanting jinxes it. I recognized that behavior because I had spent 2 years doing a version of it about my own life, and I found it both completely understandable and quietly heartbreaking to watch in someone I cared about. In the meantime, Ryan had gone quiet in a way that felt different from his previous silences. The new number had been blocked. His direct approaches had stopped. What I noticed in the absence of contact was a specific kind of clarity, the clarity that comes when noise you have been living inside for long enough to stop hearing it finally goes silent, and you understand for the first time what quiet actually sounds like. I woke up on a Tuesday morning and realized I had not thought about Ryan before noon for the first time in months, and the realization itself was a kind of gift. What occupied the space his noise had been filling was considerably better material. Chloe and I had fallen into a rhythm that had the texture of something established, not new and careful, but settled and easy. The rhythm of two people who have passed the stage of performing their best selves and arrived at the stage of simply being their actual selves in each other's vicinity. She still sent morning texts. I still showed up at the Regal Cinema more than my movie-watching habits justified. Jamie still had 2 coffees ready before I asked. These things had become the furniture of my daily life, and I noticed them the way you notice the furniture of a room you love. Not always consciously, but always with a background sense of rightness. On a Thursday evening, I was at Chloe's Holly Street apartment when Sandra came by. I had heard about Sandra, of course, in the specific detailed way you hear about the important people in someone's life, when that someone has started to talk to you about the things that actually matter to them. I knew Sandra came home tired in a way that had shaped the entire architecture of Chloe's childhood. I knew Sandra loved her daughter with a completeness that had sometimes expressed itself in ways that looked like absence, because presence requires energy that a woman working housekeeping jobs 6 days a week frequently did not have left by evening. I knew Sandra had kept a secret for 25 years that she had eventually decided her daughter deserved to know. What I did not know was how it would feel to be in the same room as her. She knocked at 7:30, still in her work clothes, carrying a container of something that smelled like the kind of home cooking that exists as its own argument for everything being okay. She stopped when she saw me, and there was a beat of assessment, the particular look of a mother encountering someone in her daughter's space for the first time, thorough and quick and entirely without apology. Then she smiled, warm and direct, and said, "You must be Maya." I said I was. She said, "I have heard a lot about you." Chloe behind her said, "Mama." Sandra said, "What? It's true," and set the food container on the kitchen counter with the air of someone who has completed the primary objective and will now take her time with the secondary ones. The three of us ate together at Chloe's small kitchen table, the kind of dinner that was not planned and was therefore more real than a planned one would have been. Sandra talked about her week with the specificity of someone who finds the details of work interesting rather than merely reportable. The family she worked for, the particular challenges of the week, a funny thing that had happened involving a vacuum cleaner and a small dog. Chloe added comments with the ease of someone who had been listening to this kind of story her whole life. I ate and listened, and felt the particular warmth of being allowed into the ordinary domestic rhythm of two people who share history. Toward the end of the meal, Sandra looked at me directly across the table with an expression that had shifted from social to something more considered. She said, "Chloe tells me you grew up in a pastor's family." I said I had. She said, "That is a specific kind of growing up." I said it was. She nodded slowly, like I had confirmed something she had already understood. She looked at her daughter then, one of those looks that passes between mothers and daughters that contains entire conversations in a second, and then she looked back at me and said, "She is a good person. In case nobody in your world is saying that to you right now, I want you to hear it from somebody." I had to set my fork down. I said, "I know she is." Sandra said, "Good," and picked up her own fork, and the dinner continued. After Sandra left, Chloe washed the dishes and I dried them, and we did not talk for a while, just moved through the small kitchen in companionable silence with the Holly Street sounds coming through the window. A dog somewhere, someone's television, the particular nighttime acoustics of an East Nashville residential block in September. When the dishes were done, she leaned against the counter and looked at me and said, "She likes you." I said, "I liked her." Chloe said, "She does not say things she does not mean. Not anymore. She used to, but she stopped." I thought about what it costs a person to stop saying things they do not mean after a lifetime of the alternative, and felt a specific kind of respect for Sandra that went beyond the evening. The gallery responded to Chloe on a Friday morning. I was at my desk at work when my phone lit up with a text from her that said only, "They said yes." 2 words. I read them and felt something expand in my chest that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with what it means to care about someone's victories as much as your own, maybe more. I typed back, "I knew they would," and then immediately left my desk to stand in the hallway and call her, because some things are too large for text messages. She answered on the first ring. Her voice had that quality it had when she was trying to contain something too big to contain. The quality of a jar with too much in it, the lid slightly ajar. She said, "It is a group show, 5 artists. The Gulch Gallery, first week of December. They want 15 pieces. I said, "Chloe." She said, "I know." I said, 15 pieces. She said, "I know." I said, "That is a lot of pieces." She said, "Maya." I said, "I am just saying that is a significant number of pieces for someone who throws drawings in the trash." There was a pause, and then she laughed, that real laugh of hers that was slightly startled, like she was always a little surprised when something was funny enough to get past her containment, and I stood in the hallway at my office building in Nashville and listened to it and felt unreasonably happy for a Thursday morning. The weeks that followed had the particular energy of someone working toward something. She drew constantly, more than I had seen her draw since I had known her, filling pages of the sketchbook with studies and sketches and ideas that she would show me some of and guard the rest of with the privacy she maintained around things in progress. The Holly Street apartment began to smell permanently of pencil and paper, and the particular focused attention of a person using their capacity fully, which is one of the best smells there is. Jamie threw herself into the logistics the way Jamie threw herself into everything she cared about, which was completely and with a volume that was difficult to argue with. She researched framing options and printing services and gallery submission requirements with an enthusiasm that suggested she had been waiting for a project of this scope. She showed up at Chloe's apartment one Saturday morning with printed spreadsheets of options and a large coffee for each of them, and a clear intention to stay until the organizational infrastructure of the show was sorted. An intention she carried out over the course of 6 hours that Chloe later described as both exhausting and completely indispensable. On a Sunday afternoon toward the end of September, I was sitting on the Holly Street steps while Chloe worked inside with the window open so we could still talk. The Nashville fall coming in earnest now, the temperature finally committing to something cooler. The trees on Holly Street going gold at the edges. She called something through the window, and I called something back, and I was sitting there in the Sunday afternoon with the street doing its quiet weekend thing around me, and I thought about a July parking garage and a yellow dress and a phone that I left between the seats of a movie theater and understood, with the particular clarity of a thing you have known for a while finally agreeing to be stated plainly, that every single thing that had happened since that Thursday had been necessary and that I would not have changed any of it. Not the hard parts. Not the parts that had scared me. Not even Ryan's yellow flowers in the vase I eventually put in the back of the cabinet. Because all of it had been the specific road to this Sunday afternoon on these specific steps with this specific window open above me and that voice coming through it. October arrived in Nashville the way it always does, decisively and without the tentative quality of September, the trees on Charlotte Pike and Holly Street committing fully to gold and amber, and that particular deep red that the Bradford pears do along the commercial strips. The air finally carrying the cool that the city had been promising since August. I had always loved Nashville in October. That October I loved it more than any previous one, and I was aware enough of why to stop pretending the weather was the primary variable. Chloe had been working on the gallery pieces with an intensity that reorganized her entire schedule around the work, in a way I found completely fascinating to be adjacent to. She had taken on fewer shifts at the Regal Cinema, negotiating with her manager for a reduced schedule that would carry her through December, and the hours she reclaimed from the cinema went directly into the Holly Street apartment, which had transformed from a living space with drawings on the walls into something that felt more like a working studio with a couch and a kitchen attached. The drawings that had always been pinned casually everywhere were now joined by larger pieces in progress, reference photographs, color studies, and a production timeline that Jamie had created and laminated and affixed to the refrigerator with 4 magnets. I came over on a Tuesday evening to find her standing in the middle of the living room, looking at 3 large pieces propped against the wall, with an expression I had learned to recognize as the specific dissatisfaction of someone who knows what they are looking for and has not found it yet. She did not hear me come in. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her look at her own work, with that fierce private attention she gave to things that mattered, and thought about the first time I had watched her draw without being seen, in the cinema corridor with the notebook and the lower lip in the complete absence of self-consciousness, and understood that I had been paying this kind of attention to her for longer than I had officially admitted to myself. She heard me eventually, and turned around, and the focused dissatisfaction on her face shifted into something warmer, without entirely disappearing, the way her face often moved between its working state and its present state when I arrived. She said, "Tell me what you see. Not what you think. What you see." She pointed at the 3 pieces against the wall. I walked over and stood where she had been standing and looked at them properly. They were 3 drawings from our stairwell series, as I had started thinking of them privately, though they were not a series in any official sense, just the accumulating record of what she had been drawing in the weeks and months of our stairwell afternoons. The first was the early one, the 2 figures from above, small against the vast corridor. The second was a closer piece, the hands on the step, the coffee cups, the space between. The third was newer, one I had not seen before, just faces in three-quarter profile. Not quite looking at each other, but angled in a way that suggested the looking was imminent. The quality of two people about to say something they have been circling. I looked at all three for a long time. Then I said, "They are a conversation." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Say more." I said, "The first one is distance. The second one is proximity. The third one is almost. They are the same story told in three distances." She looked at the pieces, and then looked at me, and then looked at the pieces again. She picked up her pencil from the table without sitting down, and made 3 small marks on a notepad, quick notations, and then set the pencil down. She said, "I need a fourth one." I said, "What is the fourth one?" She looked at me with that uncontained look, the one she stopped managing months ago. She said, "I think you know what the fourth one is." I did know. And the fact that she was going to draw it for a gallery in the Gulch in December where strangers would stand in front of it and understand what it was made, something move in my chest that was equal parts terrified and proud, and something that did not have a name but was very large. The following weekend, Donna came to East Nashville. I had arranged it carefully, not over-arranged it, not built it up into something that would collapse under its own expectations. Just a Sunday afternoon lunch at a restaurant on Gallatin Avenue that Chloe and I both liked, public and relaxed, with easy exit options and no agenda beyond 3 people eating food together in the same room. I had told Chloe what to expect from Donna, and I had told Donna what to expect from Chloe. And then I had stepped back from the expectation management entirely, because I had learned that the things that go best are the ones you prepare for, and then release. Donna arrived in her Sunday clothes, because Donna wore her Sunday clothes any time she was meeting someone for the first time, which I found both entirely predictable and genuinely touching. She was at the table when Chloe and I arrived, her hands folded on the tablecloth, her posture the particular combination of composed and nervous that I recognized from every important moment of my childhood. When she saw us come through the door, she stood up, which she did not need to do, and extended her hand to Chloe, with a formality that was Donna's version of respect. Chloe shook it and said, "It is really nice to meet you, Mrs. Donna." She said it with a southern courtesy that I had not heard from her before, and that landed perfectly, the kind of instinctive social calibration that comes from someone who has spent years reading rooms and people and understanding what a moment calls for. Donna's expression shifted from formal to something warmer in the space of that greeting. She said, "Please just call me Donna, sweetheart." They sat down. I sat between them and watched the first 30 seconds arrange themselves into something I had not dared to predict. The lunch lasted 2 hours and 15 minutes. They talked about East Nashville and how much it had changed, and Donna's opinion on the best hot chicken in the city, and Chloe's opinion on the best hot chicken in the city, and a lengthy and genuinely entertaining disagreement about a place on Dickerson Pike that Donna swore by, and Chloe had complicated feelings about. They talked about Sandra and what it was like growing up in East Nashville in the years before the neighborhood became what it was now. They talked about the gallery show, and Donna asked specific questions about the work, and Chloe answered them with the careful enthusiasm of someone who is talking about something they love to someone who is actually listening. I sat between them and contributed to the conversation, and also spent a portion of my attention simply observing the two of them existing in the same space, my mama and this person who had become the center of my daily life, and feeling something that was close to wonder at the fact that they were talking about hot chicken with the ease of people who had met somewhere reasonable rather than at the end of the most complicated year of my life. At the end of the meal, when Chloe went to the restroom, Donna leaned across the table and looked at me with an expression I had only seen a handful of times in my life. The expression she had when she had arrived at something true at some cost to her previous certainty. She said, "She is good, Maya. She is really genuinely good." I said I knew. She said, "I can see why." She said it simply, without qualification, without the careful hedging that had characterized the earlier conversations about this part of my life. I looked at my mama across a Gallatin Avenue restaurant table in October and felt something heal that I had not been certain was healable. That evening, after dropping Donna at her car and driving Chloe back to Holly Street, I sat on the steps outside her apartment in the October Nashville night while she made tea inside. The street was quiet, the trees overhead fully golden now, the fall air carrying that particular smell of leaves beginning their seasonal return to the ground. I thought about a July parking garage and the word regret that Ryan had used twice in the same number of months and felt, with a completeness that left no room for argument, that regret was the least accurate word in the English language for anything I was currently experiencing. Chloe came out with 2 mugs of tea and sat beside me on the steps. She handed me a mug and looked at the street and said, "Your mama is something else." I said, "She really is." She said, "She loves you so much it is almost uncomfortable to be in the vicinity of." I laughed at that. She was not wrong. We sat on the Holly Street steps in the October evening with our tea and the gold trees overhead and the East Nashville night doing its gentle thing around us, and I thought that if someone had told me in July that this was where the summer was going, I would not have believed them. I believed it completely now. The second week of October, Chloe went to Memphis. She had been talking about it since September, in the way she talked about things that mattered enormously, which was carefully and in pieces, never all at once. The information offered in small portions the way you offer something fragile. Not because you think the other person will drop it, but because the act of handing it over gradually is its own form of protection. She had made contact with David in late September, a short message sent from her Instagram account on a Tuesday evening, while I sat on the other end of the Holly Street couch, pretending to read, and actually paying attention to the quality of her breathing. He had responded within an hour. The response had been long. She had shown me his message that same evening, handing me her phone without comment the way she handed me things that she needed another set of eyes on, not for an opinion, but for a witness. I read it sitting on her couch while she sat beside me with her hands in her lap and said nothing. He wrote with the specific care of someone who has been composing a message in their head for years and is finally being given the address to send it to. He mentioned things only a father would know, details from a childhood he had been present for until he was not. A red bicycle with training wheels, a stuffed elephant she had called Peanut, the name of the teacher at her elementary school, who had recognized something in her drawings and told Sandra about it at a parent conference he had attended. He wrote that he had tried to reach her through Sandra years ago and had understood from the silence that the door was not open. He wrote that he had a life now, a good one, and that the only missing thing in it was the knowledge of how she was. I handed the phone back to her when I finished reading. She was looking at the middle distance the way she did when she was processing something at depth. I did not say anything for a moment. Then I said, "He paid attention." She said, "He remembered Peanut." Her voice was level in the way it was level when something was very large, and she was managing it with both hands. I said, "That matters." She said, "I know." We sat on the couch while the Holly Street evening came in through the window, and she did not cry, and I did not push, and the moment held itself with the dignity she had decided to give it. She booked the bus ticket to Memphis 2 weeks later, a Saturday departure, returning the same evening. She told me on a Thursday evening with the practicality of someone reporting logistics. Departure time 7:15 in the morning, arrival 11:40, the address in a neighborhood called Cooper Young that she had looked up and found to be a place with coffee shops and bookstores and a mural on the side of a building that she had seen in a photograph and thought she would like. She said it the way she said things she had decided about, not asking for input on the decision, but sharing it as a completed fact. I respected that. I told her I would be at the Nashville bus station when she got back. She said I did not have to do that. I said I knew. She looked at me for a moment and then said, "Okay." The Saturday she left, I woke up early without an alarm. The particular wakefulness of a day that matters to someone you love. I texted her at 6:55. "Safe travels. I am here." She replied from what I imagined was the Greyhound station on McGavick Street. "I know. Thank you." 2 words that contained more than 2 words. I put my phone on the charger and went to make coffee and spent the first hour of that Saturday doing the thing where you perform normalcy so thoroughly that you almost convince yourself you feel it. Jamie had sensed the tenor of the day with her usual radar and arrived at my apartment on Charlotte Pike at 9:30 with pastries from a bakery on Gallatin and the stated intention of keeping me company until further notice. She did not mention Memphis directly for the first 2 hours, which was the Jamie equivalent of extraordinary restraint, filling the time instead with a detailed account of a situation at the cinema involving a malfunctioning projector and a showing of an animated film and 43 children who had opinions about the interruption. I listened and laughed and ate the pastries and was genuinely grateful for every word of it. Chloe texted at 11:58. I am outside. Cannot go in yet. I read that and felt something move in my chest that was entirely about her standing on a sidewalk in Cooper Young, Memphis, in front of a door that had been closed for 25 years. I typed, "Take all the time you need. I am right here." Jamie, reading over my shoulder with a complete absence of shame, put her hand briefly on my arm and then went to make more coffee without saying anything. Sometimes Jamie's best quality was knowing when to be quiet. The 43 minutes between that text and the next one were the longest 43 minutes of that Saturday. I sat on my Charlotte Pike balcony in the October afternoon and watched the street and thought about a little girl in East Nashville who had grown up with an empty space where a parent had been and had filled it with drawings and library books and the pure disciplined force of her own self-sufficiency, and who was standing on a Memphis sidewalk right now doing the bravest kind of thing, which is walking toward the answer to a question you have been afraid to ask. Her text at 12:41 said, "I went in." I held my phone for a moment after reading that. Then I showed it to Jamie, who was back on the couch. Jamie looked at it and nodded once and said, "Good," in a voice that was quieter than her usual register, and went back to her coffee. We did not talk much for the next hour. We did not need to. She called from the Memphis bus station at 5:50 in the afternoon. I was already in the parking lot of the Nashville Greyhound station on McGavick Street, having arrived 40 minutes early with 2 coffees from a place on Charlotte Pike that I had driven out of my way to get because they were her specific preference, and the day called for specificity. She said, "I am on the bus." I said, "I know, I am in the parking lot." A pause. Then, "Maya." I said, "Just get here." She came through the terminal doors at 7:22 with her backpack over one shoulder and her sketchbook under her arm, and the particular quality of someone who has been somewhere that rearranged something fundamental and is still in the process of understanding the new arrangement. She saw me and stopped walking for a second, the way she had done at the Regal Cinema on a July evening a lifetime ago, that brief pause of someone recalibrating to an unexpected kindness. Then she came the rest of the way, and I held out one of the coffees and she took it with both hands and looked at me, and I looked at her, and then she put both coffees in one hand and hugged me with the other arm, and I hugged her back properly, and we stood in the Nashville Greyhound station parking lot on McGavick Street in the October evening, doing that for longer than was strictly necessary, and neither of us moved to stop it. We sat in my parked car for an hour and 15 minutes while she told me about David. He was 52 years old with silver at his temples and Chloe's exact eyes and the hands of someone who spent his days writing on whiteboards. His partner Marcus had been there, quietly present in the kitchen making sandwiches nobody ate, understanding that some conversations require a specific kind of witness, and that witness was not him today. David had been sitting down when she came in and had stood up when he saw her and had stayed completely still for a moment. And she said the stillness was the thing she would remember. The way he went absolutely still, like someone who has learned to be very careful about hoping and is trying to confirm that what they are seeing is real before they allow themselves to respond to it. They had talked for 3 hours and 40 minutes. She had not cried in front of him. She had asked every question she had been holding for 25 years, and he had answered every one without deflection, not perfectly, not with explanations that made everything neat, but honestly, which was what she had come for. He had asked about her life, and she had told him about the cinema, and the sketchbook, and the gallery show, and Sandra and East Nashville. And she had told him about me, briefly and without elaboration, and he had looked at her with those eyes that were her eyes, and said, "I am glad you found your people." She stopped talking for a moment when she got to that part. I watched her look at the McGavick Street parking lot through the windshield with an expression that was doing several things at once. Then she said, "I went there to find out if he was a person or a story. He is a person. A real, complicated, imperfect person who made decisions that cost me something and has been living with that." She paused. "I do not know yet what we are to each other going forward. But I know the story I was living with was not the whole truth. And the whole truth, even the hard parts of it, is better than the incomplete version." I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "Yeah." She said, "Yeah." We drove back to East Nashville in the October dark, with the Nashville skyline doing its thing on the left side of the highway, and the radio on something low, and neither of us feeling the need to fill the silence, because the silence was already full. The days after Memphis had a specific texture that I recognized from other moments of significant recalibration in my own life. That quality of the world looking the same from the outside, while something fundamental has been rearranged on the inside, and you are still taking inventory of the new configuration. Chloe went back to work at the Regal Cinema the Monday after, and I watched her from the concession counter with the particular attention I paid to her in the days after something large, looking for signs of how she was carrying it. She carried it the way she carried most things, quietly and with both hands. The weight of it visible only in small moments. A pause in the middle of a sentence, a look toward the middle distance that lasted a second longer than the conversation required. We talked about Memphis in pieces over the following week, not as a single conversation, but as additions to an ongoing one, details she remembered and offered when they surfaced, rather than in a structured account. She told me that David's partner, Marcus, had left a sandwich on the kitchen table for her before he went out, wrapped in paper towel with a small note that said, "In case you need something," in handwriting that was careful and kind. She told me that David had a photograph on his refrigerator of a drawing she had made at age 7, that Sandra must have given him before everything fell apart. A child's drawing of a house with a large sun in the corner that she did not specifically remember making, but recognized as hers from the particular way she had always drawn the sun, with too many rays pointing in too many directions. She told me he had kept it on his refrigerator for 25 years. When she told me that last part, she was looking at the middle distance, and I let her look. On a Thursday evening, we were sitting in the back booth of a diner on Gallatin Avenue that had been there since before either of us was born. The kind of place with vinyl seats and laminated menus and coffee that came in a thick ceramic mug without anyone asking if you wanted it. She had her sketchbook open on the table and was working on something I could not see from my side of the booth, pencil moving in quick, short strokes. I was working through a work email on my phone that did not urgently require my attention, but gave my hand something to do while she drew. We had been in the diner for an hour and had covered about 40 minutes of actual conversation, and 20 minutes of comfortable parallel occupation, which was a ratio I had come to understand as one of the better things available to two people in each other's company. She turned the sketchbook around and slid it across the table to me. It was a drawing of the Memphis living room as she remembered it, loose and atmospheric, the couch and the window and a suggestion of two figures sitting across from each other, the younger one's posture carrying something that was open and braced at the same time, the older one leaning forward slightly in a way that read as trying. In the corner of the drawing, small and detailed in contrast to the looseness of everything else, the refrigerator door with its single piece of paper held by a magnet. She had drawn the drawing on the refrigerator. I looked at that detail for a long time. I said, "You are going to put this in the show." It was not a question. She said, "I was not planning to." I said, "Chloe." She looked at the drawing and then at me, and then at the drawing again. She said, "It is very personal." I said, "The best ones always are." She pulled the sketchbook back slowly and looked at the drawing for a moment with that focused private expression. Then she picked up the pencil and made one small notation in the margin, the kind of mark she made when something had been decided, and said, "Maybe." In Chloe's vocabulary, maybe was considerably closer to yes than it appeared. The gallery confirmed the logistics in the second week of October. 15 pieces. Opening reception the first Thursday of December. Her name on the list of 5 featured artists in the promotional materials that they sent over as a draft for her approval. She forwarded it to me with no message, and I sat at my work desk and looked at her name in the artist list and felt something in my chest that I had no word for in any vocabulary I currently owned. I typed back, "There is your name." She typed back, "There it is." We were quiet for a moment across the text thread, and then she sent a photograph of George the houseplant in the corner of the Holly Street apartment. An inexplicable response that was entirely explicable if you knew her, which I did. Jamie's organizational involvement in the gallery show escalated significantly in the final weeks of October. She had appointed herself unofficial production manager with an authority that nobody had granted, and nobody was willing to challenge, because she was consistently right about everything she touched. She sourced framing materials at a price that required 3 days of phone calls and a level of negotiation that I found impressive and slightly alarming. She coordinated the transport of the finished pieces with the precision of someone who had missed a calling in logistics. She created a guest list spreadsheet with color-coded columns that included a column labeled Vibe, whose criteria she declined to explain, but which she applied with absolute consistency. I was in the Vibe column. I did not ask which color. Sandra was in the Vibe column. Donna, after a conversation between Jamie and me that I was not entirely present for, but which Jamie summarized as handled, was also in the Vibe column. The question of my daddy, Pastor Gerald, was a conversation that happened on a Wednesday evening when Chloe and I were on the Holly Street steps, and I brought it up with the careful approach of someone carrying something breakable. I said I did not know if he would come even if invited. She said, "You do not have to invite him for him. You can invite him for you." I thought about that for the rest of the evening. I called my daddy on a Thursday night, which was our historically neutral night, the night with no church obligations attached to it that had always been the easiest night to have real conversations when they happened. He answered on the third ring with the voice he used when he was surprised to see my name on the screen, which told me that I had not been calling enough and that he had noticed. We talked around the edges of things for a few minutes the way we always did. The cousin's new baby, a church renovation he was overseeing, the weather that October was doing, all of it the small stones you lay down before the large ones. Then I told him about the gallery show. I told him a friend of mine was showing her artwork for the first time in a real gallery space, and that it was in December, and that I wanted him to come. I did not qualify the friend. I did not explain or contextualize or prepare him. I just said a friend and the gallery and December and waited. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What kind of art does she do?" I said, "Drawings, pencil. She is extraordinary." He was quiet again. Then he said, "Send me the information, Maya." Not yes, not no. Send me the information. Which from Pastor Gerald in October was further than I had expected to get, and I recognized it as such. I sent him the gallery information that night, and did not follow up, and did not mention it to Chloe, because there were some things you waited to see before you described them. I told her only that I had called my daddy, and that the conversation had been okay. She looked at me with those eyes of hers and said, "Okay is good." I said, "Okay is very good." She nodded once and went back to the drawing she had been working on, and I sat beside her on the couch and watched the Holly Street evening come in through the window and felt the particular quality of a month that is building toward something. The way October always feels like it is preparing for something larger than itself. On the last Saturday of October, we went to the basement on 8th Avenue to see a band that Chloe had been listening to for years in the specific devoted way she had with music she loved, knowing every word and never quite letting on how much she knew them until the lights went down and the first notes started, and then being completely unable to contain it. The basement was small and warm and packed, the crowd pressed together in the way of small venue crowds that creates an involuntary intimacy with the people around you. She had been there before many times. I had been there twice. The band was extraordinary in the specific way of bands that have been playing together long enough to stop thinking about playing and start thinking about something beyond it. Chloe stood beside me in the crowd and sang along under her breath, not performing the singing but genuinely inside it. And I stood close enough that I could hear her above the music if I leaned slightly toward her, and I stayed leaned slightly toward her for the entire set. At some point in the third song, the crowd shifted, and the space between us went from close to closer, and she reached back without looking, and found my hand, and held it, and we stayed like that through the rest of the show. Her hand in mine in the warm noise of the basement on a Nashville October Saturday night, and I thought that this was what people meant when they talked about moments that pay for everything that came before them. November arrived in Nashville with the particular relief of a city that has been hot for 7 months, finally receiving permission to be something else. The trees on Charlotte Pike and Holly Street finished what October had started, going from gold to bare in the span of 2 weeks, the leaves coming down in the dry, windy days of early November, and collecting against the curbs and the steps of the old houses in East Nashville, in drifts that smelled like every good thing about the season. I had always liked November in Tennessee. That November I walked through it differently, with more attention. The way you walk through a place when you are genuinely present in it, rather than passing through on the way to somewhere else. The gallery show was 5 weeks away, and Chloe was in the final intensive stage of the work. The stage where the pieces that had been in progress for months were arriving at their finished forms, and the ones that were not quite there yet were requiring the kind of focused daily attention that left her tired in a specific productive way at the end of each session, the tiredness of someone spending themselves on something that matters. I came to the Holly Street apartment on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, and sometimes on Sunday afternoons, and the rhythm of those visits had the comfortable inevitability of things that have found their natural pattern. She showed me the finished pieces as they were completed, not all at once but one at a time, the way she had always offered things, in portions that the moment could hold. The Memphis drawing had made it into the show, the living room with its 2 figures and the refrigerator with the child's drawing in the corner. She had worked on it for 3 weeks after the Thursday diner conversation, and the finished version was larger than her usual scale, filling a sheet that required both hands to hold, the looseness of the original sketch refined into something that had weight and stillness, and the specific quality of a moment that has been looked at long enough to reveal its structure. The 4th stairwell piece existed. She had not shown it to me yet. I knew it existed because I had seen her working on something she angled away from me on 2 separate visits, a habit she had with work in progress that I respected without comment, and because Jamie had texted me a single message on a Tuesday afternoon that said, "She finished it," with no further elaboration, and then did not respond when I asked what she meant. I waited. Waiting for Chloe to show me things in her own time was a skill I had developed over months, and which I had come to understand as one of the ways I loved her. The particular discipline of not rushing someone toward readiness they have not arrived at yet. My daddy came to church the first Sunday of November and asked to speak with me after the service. I had not been to his church since August, which we had not discussed directly, and which sat between us as an acknowledged absence rather than a confrontation. I stood with him in the parking lot after the congregation dispersed. The November Sunday cold enough for jackets now. The Bradford pears along the church driveway bare and clean against the gray sky. He looked older than the last time I had looked at him with full attention, which made me understand that I had been managing my looking for a while, keeping it surface level to avoid the depth of something I was not ready for. He said he had been thinking about the gallery information I had sent. He said he had been thinking about a lot of things since the spring and the summer, and that the thinking had been difficult and was not finished. He said this with the particular honesty of a man who does not find honesty easy, and has decided to practice it anyway, and I recognized the effort of it, and felt something soften in my chest toward him that I had been keeping firm for the protection of it. He said, "I do not have everything figured out, Maya. I want you to know that I know that." I said, "I know, Daddy." He said, "I am working on it." I said, "I know that too." He did not say he was coming to the gallery. He did not say he was not coming. He hugged me in the church parking lot, with the particular hug of a father who is trying to say something his words are not ready for yet. The kind of hug that is doing double work. And I let it do its double work, and hugged him back, and we said goodbye. And I drove to East Nashville and sat on the Holly Street steps and called my mama. Donna picked up immediately. I told her about the church parking lot conversation. She was quiet for a moment. And then she said, "He has been up late a lot of nights, baby. I hear him in the kitchen at 2 a.m. I thought about my daddy at 2 a.m, in a Nashville kitchen, working through something at the kitchen table, the way he had always worked through his sermons, slowly and with his whole self." I said, "I hope he gets there." She said, "He is trying to get there. For him, that is the same thing." I thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. Chloe was inside working when I got to Holly Street. She came to the door when she heard me on the steps and looked at my face with that reading quality of hers and said, "Come in." She made tea without asking. The specific tea she kept for the evenings when things were heavy, a chamomile blend from a shop on Gallatin that smelled like something your grandmother would have made if your grandmother had good taste in herbs. We sat on the Holly Street couch with the tea, and I told her about the church parking lot and my daddy's 2 a.m. kitchen visits, and she listened the way she listened, completely and without rush. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Some people need more time to arrive somewhere than others. That does not mean they are not on their way." I looked at her on the couch in the November Holly Street evening and thought that she was talking about my daddy, and also about something larger, about the general project of people trying to expand toward things they were not built for, and that the patience she had for that project was one of the most specific things I loved about her. She set her tea down and reached beside the couch and picked up her sketchbook. She held it for a moment without opening it, that familiar pause of hers before something she has decided but is still landing into. Then she opened it and turned it to face me. It was the 4th stairwell piece. I had been right about what it was. It was the 2 of us in the Regal Cinema stairwell, but not from above or from the side or in the careful studied distance of the earlier pieces. It was close, a medium-close view from a slight angle, and it showed the moment I recognized immediately. The moment on the stairwell when I had come back after disappearing for a week, and had told her that the only place I felt whole was here, and she had reached out her hand, and I had taken it. She had drawn the exact second of the hands meeting, not before, not after, the precise moment of contact, and she had drawn it with the kind of attention that could only come from someone who had been inside that moment as fully as I had been. I looked at that drawing for a long time. The tea went cool in my hand. Outside the Holly Street window, the November Nashville evening was doing its quiet thing. George the houseplant made no comment. When I finally looked up, she was watching me with those eyes that had been watching me since July, with an attention I had first found disarming and had come to understand as one of the primary ways she showed love, by seeing things completely and not looking away. I said, "This is the one." She said, "I know." I said, "This is the whole story in one drawing." She said, "That is what I was going for." I set the tea down on the coffee table and looked at her for a moment. This woman who had been holding my lost phone in a movie theater corridor 4 months ago, who had handed it back carefully because she understood it mattered, who had been keeping things carefully ever since. I said, "Thank you for showing me." She said, "I was always going to show you. I just needed to finish it first." We sat on the couch for the rest of that evening with the finished sketchbook between us, going through the gallery pieces in the order she planned to hang them, she talking about each one and me listening and asking questions, and the November Nashville night settling in around the Holly Street apartment with the particular tenderness of a season that knows its job is to make room for what comes next. At some point, without deciding to, I took her hand on the couch, the way she had taken mine on the basement dance floor, and she turned her hand over and held mine back. And we sat like that in the lamplight, with the show 5 weeks away, and the whole of December still ahead of us, and the feeling in the room of something that had been building since July finally arriving at the place it had been heading all along. The first week of December came in cold by Nashville standards. The kind of cold that the city treats as a genuine event. People pulling out coats that had been in storage since February, and talking about the temperature with the communal surprise of a place that is always slightly unprepared for winter, despite winter arriving on the same schedule every year. The Holly Street trees were bare now, the last of the leaves gone, and the street had that clean, spare quality of November carried into December. Everything stripped to its essential structure, the architecture of things visible without the softening of foliage. The gallery opening was the first Thursday of December at 7 p.m. The gallery was on a side street in the Gulch, one of those Nashville neighborhoods that had remade itself over a decade from industrial to intentional. The old warehouses and brick buildings converted into restaurants and studios, and small commercial spaces that carried the bones of their previous lives in the exposed brick and the high ceilings. The gallery itself was a long rectangular room with white walls and concrete floors and track lighting that could be adjusted for each show, intimate enough to feel like a real space rather than a warehouse, and large enough to hold the work of 5 artists without crowding. Chloe had been there twice in the preceding week for installation, both times without me, because installation was part of the work, and the work was hers alone. She came home from the second visit on a Tuesday evening, and sat on the couch and said, "It looks right," with the specific relief of someone who had been genuinely uncertain whether it would. I had learned enough about her process to understand that "it looks right" was the highest available praise she gave to her own work, and that it cost her something to say it out loud, like naming a good thing too directly might disturb it. I said, "I cannot wait to see it." She said, "I am nervous about you seeing it." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because you are in some of it." I said, "Chloe, I know I am in some of it." She said, "Knowing and seeing are different things." I thought about that for the rest of the evening. The Thursday of the opening, I left work at 4 and went home to Charlotte Pike and got dressed with the particular attention of someone who understands that the occasion has a specific gravity and wants to meet it appropriately. I wore something I had bought for myself on a Saturday afternoon in October at a boutique on 12th Avenue South, a deep green dress that I had tried on and stood in front of the mirror with for a long time before buying it. Not because I was uncertain about it, but because I wanted to register the choosing of it. The fact that I had walked in alone and tried on things until I found something I liked and bought it without consulting anyone. I put on the small gold earrings that had been my grandmother's and looked at myself in the Charlotte Pike apartment mirror and thought that I looked like someone who was going somewhere that mattered. I arrived at the gallery at 6:45. Jamie was already there, which was both unsurprising and slightly impressive, given the logistical scope of what she had been managing for the past 6 weeks. She was wearing what she had described as appropriate gallery attire and which was, as advertised, her regular self turned up approximately 20% in formality, while remaining entirely Jamie. She saw me come in and crossed the room and handed me a glass of sparkling water with the air of someone completing a task on a list. She said, "She is in the back. The work is incredible. Do not tell her I said that yet, because she is still in the managing her nerves phase and a compliment will break her concentration." I said I would save it. Jamie said, "Good. Your mama is coming at 7. I confirmed this morning." I said I knew. Jamie said, "The other one too." I looked at her. She said, "Your daddy, Maya. He called me to confirm the address." I stood in the gallery entrance holding my sparkling water and said nothing for a moment. Jamie looked at me with an expression that was the closest thing to gentle I had ever seen on her face. She said, "I know." She patted my arm once and went back to whatever she had been doing. The gallery filled gradually from 7 onward, with the particular mix of a Nashville arts opening, other artists and their people, gallery regulars, the curious and the connected, the kind of crowd that moves through a space with genuine attention rather than the performed attention of obligation. The work of all 5 artists was strong, and the room had an energy of real engagement, People stopping in front of pieces for actual time, rather than the polite moment of acknowledgement that passes for looking at things in less serious contexts. Chloe's 15 pieces were hung along the long wall on the left side of the gallery and the facing wall at the back, arranged in the order she had planned, which was not chronological, but emotional, beginning with the large atmospheric pieces of East Nashville streets and the regal cinema interior, and moving through the more intimate work toward the stairwell series at the back wall. The Memphis piece was there, the living room with the refrigerator in the corner, and it stopped people the way the best work stops people, not with spectacle but with recognition, the feeling of having seen something true. The fourth stairwell piece was the last one on the back wall. At the end of the sequence, the largest piece in the series and the most intimate. I walked toward it gradually, taking the other pieces in order the way she had arranged them to be taken, feeling the sequence build the way she had intended it to build, distance to proximity to almost to contact. When I reached the fourth piece, I stood in front of it for a long time. Seeing it on the gallery wall, lit by the track lighting, larger than I had seen it in the sketchbook, was what she had said it would be. Knowing and seeing were different things. She had drawn the moment of our hands meeting with such specific attention to the quality of that second, the hesitation just before, the decision in the contact itself, that standing in front of it felt like being inside the memory rather than looking at a record of it. I felt someone beside me and turned. It was not Chloe. It was Donna, standing with her coat still on because she had just arrived, looking at the drawing on the wall with an expression I had to look at twice to read, because it was not an expression I had seen on her before. It was the expression of someone understanding something in real time. Not intellectually, but actually. The way you understand things when the evidence is visual and undeniable and beautiful. She said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, not quite to me, and not quite to herself, "She sees you." 3 words. I put my hand on my mama's arm, and she put her hand over mine, and we stood in front of that drawing together, and I let the moment be exactly what it was. Sandra arrived at 7:30 with a pin on her coat lapel that was a small purple iris, which I did not comment on, and which nearly undid me. She went directly to the Memphis piece and stood in front of it for a long time, and I watched her from across the gallery and understood what it must cost a woman to look at a drawing her daughter made of the day she went to find the father Sandra had sent away. The full weight of that story visible in the piece for anyone who knew it, and beautiful for anyone who did not. Sandra stood in front of it with her shoulders straight and her chin up, and then she nodded once, to herself or to the drawing, or to the general project of things being survived and made into art, and moved on to the next piece. I saw my daddy come in at 7:45. He stood at the entrance for a moment in his good coat, taking in the room with the considered attention of a man who approaches unfamiliar environments carefully. He was alone, which meant Donna had not come with him, which meant he had come separately and on his own decision, which told me everything about what it had cost him and what it meant. I crossed the gallery to where he was standing. He looked at me, and then looked at the room and said, "This is a real place." I said, "It is a real place, Daddy." He said, "Show me her work." I walked him through the pieces on the left wall, staying beside him, watching him look with the unhurried attention he brought to things he was taking seriously. He said nothing for most of it. In front of the Memphis piece, he stopped for a longer time than he had stopped at any of the others, and I stood beside him and let him look. He found me later in the evening when I was near the back wall. He stood beside me for a moment, looking at the fourth stairwell piece, the hands, the moment of contact. He did not say anything about the drawing specifically. He put his hand briefly on my shoulder, one firm press, and said, "You look well, Maya." It was not what I had hoped for, and it was more than I had expected, and it was real, which was the thing that mattered. I said, "Thank you for coming, Daddy." He said, "Of course." He stayed for another 40 minutes and shook hands with Jamie, who handled that interaction with a poise that I found genuinely impressive, and then he said his goodbyes, and left, and I stood in the gallery and felt the particular complicated tenderness of loving a person through their limitations. Chloe found me near the end of the evening, when the crowd had thinned to the people who stay until the last possible moment, because they cannot quite bring themselves to leave a good thing. She was still slightly electric the way she was after a long session of sustained focus, not tired yet, running on the adrenaline of the work having been seen and received and responded to. She stood beside me and looked at the room and said, "It went well." I said, "Chloe, it was extraordinary." She turned and looked at me with that expression she had when she was deciding whether to accept a thing fully. I said, "Your daddy called the gallery to confirm the address." Her expression shifted. I said, "He was here. He stood in front of the Memphis piece for a long time." She looked at the Memphis piece across the room for a moment. Then she looked at me. Her eyes were bright in the gallery track lighting. She said, "Okay." I said, "Okay." She took my hand, and I held it, and we stood in the Gulch Gallery on a December Thursday in Nashville, with the work on the walls around us, and the people she loved somewhere in the room, and felt the particular quality of an evening that has given everything it promised, and a little more. The week after the gallery opening had the particular quality of the week after something you have been building toward for a long time. That specific mixture of relief and mild disorientation that comes when the thing you have been oriented around is finished, and you have to recalibrate to a horizon that is no longer defined by a single point. Chloe described it on a Monday morning as feeling like she had been holding her breath for 6 weeks and had finally exhaled, and now was not entirely sure what to do with all the available air. I understood that feeling from my own life in ways I did not need to explain to her, because she already knew them. The response to the show had been real and specific, not the polite generalized praise that attends most things, but the kind of response that has detail in it. People reaching out through her Instagram with references to particular pieces, the Memphis drawing mentioned most often, and the stairwell series mentioned in a way that told her the sequence had worked the way she intended, that people had felt the movement of it from distance to contact and had understood what they were feeling. A woman who ran a small arts publication in Nashville had reached out about a feature. 2 people had inquired about purchasing pieces. Jamie had screenshot every message and sent them to a group chat she had titled, without consultation, Chloe's Fan Club, which contained herself and me and Sandra, and which Chloe had joined with a complaint and stayed in without one. David had sent a message the Saturday after the opening. He had seen photographs of the Memphis piece that Chloe had posted on her Instagram, and his message was short and careful and said, "I saw the drawing. I do not have the right words for what that is like to look at. I am proud of you, Chloe. For all of it." She showed me the message on a Sunday morning when we were at the breakfast place on Fatherland Street, the one with the mismatched mugs and the chalkboard menu, the place that had become ours in the specific way that certain places become yours when you keep choosing them. She handed me her phone across the table without comment and watched me read it, and when I handed it back, she looked at it once more and set the phone face down beside her coffee and said, "Okay." She said okay the way she said okay about large things, making it contain more than it looked like it could hold. I asked if she was going to write back. She said she already had. She said she had written, "Thank you, David. That means something." I thought about the economy of that response, the precision of it, the way it accepted what was offered without asking for more than had been given, and thought that it was exactly right in the way that Chloe's things tended to be exactly right when she had thought about them long enough. She was not rushing toward a relationship with him. She was not closing the door. She was standing in the opening and deciding what she could see from there before she decided how far to go in. Sandra had called Chloe the morning after the opening, and they had talked for an hour, which was longer than their usual calls by a significant margin. Chloe told me about it on the Fatherland Street Sunday, with the particular care she used when she was handling something that had moved her more than she wanted to show. Sandra had said that watching people stand in front of the work and respond to it had made her understand something she had not understood before, that the things Chloe had been doing alone in that East Nashville bedroom with library books and pencils had not been a way of getting through a difficult childhood, but had been the actual substance of who her daughter was, and that she was sorry it had taken her this long to see it that way. Chloe told me this looking at her coffee mug, and when she looked up, her eyes were bright, and she said, "She has never apologized for anything before, not directly like that." I said, "How did it feel?" She said, "Like something I did not know I needed until I had it." I reached across the Fatherland Street table and she took my hand, and we sat like that for a while with the Sunday morning moving around us, and neither of us needing to add anything to what had already been said. The second week of December brought the first real cold of the Nashville winter, temperatures dropping into the 20s at night, and the city doing its annual performance of mild surprise at the existence of weather below 40 degrees. I bought a heavier coat that I had been putting off buying since October, and Chloe laughed at it when she saw it, because it was significantly larger than the situation called for. And I told her that I had grown up in Nashville and was still fundamentally unprepared for cold, and she said that was one of her favorite things about me. And I told her that was a low bar, and she said she had high bars for everything else. My daddy called on a Wednesday evening. He called at 8 o'clock, which was his deliberate time, late enough that the day's obligations were finished, early enough that the call was not an emergency. He asked how I was. I told him honestly. He asked about work. I told him. There was a pause in the conversation of the particular kind that his calls had been carrying for months. The pause where the real subject waited to see if this was its moment. This time I did not wait for him to decide. I said, "Daddy, what did you think of the show?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I thought it was serious work, Maya. I thought it was made by someone who sees the world in a way worth paying attention to." I held my phone and looked at the Charlotte Pike window and the December Nashville night beyond it. I said, "I think so too." He said, "I know you do." Another pause. Then, "I am glad I went." I said, "I am glad you came." He said, "We should have dinner. The four of us. Me and your mama and you and—" He stopped. The name was the thing he had not yet crossed the distance to. I waited. He said, "You're Chloe." 2 words that had cost him something, and that I received as the significant thing they were. I said, "I would like that very much, Daddy." I called Chloe immediately after I hung up with him. She answered on the second ring with a voice that said she could already tell from the quality of my calling that something had shifted. I told her about the dinner conversation and the 2 words at the end and the distance they had crossed. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Your daddy said my Chloe." I said, "He did." Another moment of quiet. Then she said, "Okay." That okay again, the large one, the one that held everything. I said, "Okay." She said, "When?" I said, "I was thinking after Christmas. January, maybe. Somewhere neutral." She said, "Somewhere with good food." I said, "Obviously." She said, "Okay then." I said, "Okay then." We stayed on the phone for another hour talking about other things. A movie she wanted to see, and a book I had been reading, and a road trip we had been talking about in the abstract way you talk about things you are going to do eventually. And at some point the conversation became the comfortable late evening kind that has no agenda, and ends only because sleep becomes necessary rather than because the talking is finished. The week before Christmas, I was at the Holly Street apartment on a Friday evening when Chloe came out of the back room where she had been working with an expression that I recognized as the post-work expression, the one that appeared when something had been resolved rather than abandoned. She sat beside me on the couch and showed me what she had been doing. It was a new drawing, not for the gallery, not part of any series I recognized, just something she had made. It was the Fatherland Street breakfast place, the table by the window. 2 figures across from each other with coffee mugs between them. The Sunday morning light from the window falling across the scene in diagonal lines. It was us on a Sunday. A specific Sunday, I could tell from details she had included, the particular angle of the light that only existed in early December, the coats on the backs of the chairs. She had drawn a recent morning while it was still recent. I said, "When did you make this?" She said, This week. In pieces. I kept seeing it in my head and I needed to put it somewhere. I looked at the drawing. The two figures and the coffee and the Sunday light and the specific quality of a morning that had felt ordinary and significant at the same time. And I understood what she had been doing all along. Across all the drawings and all the months, she had been keeping things, the way she had said in the park in September, keeping the things that were worth keeping against the inevitable movement of time that takes everything if you do not find a way to hold it. She had been holding us in the only way she knew how, which was the truest way she knew how, with her hands and a pencil and the patient specific attention of someone who has decided that something is worth the full cost of seeing. I looked at the drawing for a long time, and then I looked at her and I said, "You have been drawing us this whole time," she said, "from almost the beginning." I said, "Even before you knew what it was." She said, "Especially then. That is usually when the drawing is most honest, before you know what you are looking at." I thought about that. I thought about a July evening in a movie theater corridor with a lost phone and a pair of hands holding it carefully and a smile that appeared before its owner decided about it, and how all of it had been the beginning of something that neither of us had the vocabulary for yet, and how she had been drawing it anyway, keeping it in the only language available to her, against the day when we would have the words. I leaned over and kissed her, soft and certain, the kind of kiss that does not have to announce itself, because it belongs where it lands. She put her hand against my face the way she did, that particular warmth of it that I had come to understand as one of the primary ways she was present to me, and kissed me back with the ease of something practiced, and the feeling of something that is still, despite everything, slightly astonishing. Outside the Holly Street window, the December Nashville night was doing its cold, quiet thing. The bare trees and the amber streetlights, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of the city that never entirely goes silent. George the houseplant made no comment. The drawings on the walls held their positions. The sketchbook sat on the coffee table with its record of everything we had been to each other since July, and we sat on the Holly Street couch in the December lamplight and were simply and completely here. Christmas in Nashville that year was the kind that the city does when the weather cooperates, cold enough to feel like the season without the ice that makes everything difficult. The lights on Broadway and the decorations in the neighborhoods and the particular quality of the city in late December, when it slows down enough to notice itself. Charlotte Pike was strung with lights along the commercial strip, and the residential blocks of East Nashville had their own particular version of the season. The old houses decorated with the idiosyncratic care of people who have strong opinions about what looks right and are not interested in the subdivision uniform approach to holiday aesthetics. Holly Street had a wreath on almost every door, and the bare trees along the sidewalk wrapped in small white lights that made the street look like something from a photograph you would keep. I spent Christmas Eve with my family at my parents' house in the Bellevue neighborhood where I had grown up. The house with the particular smell of every December of my childhood, pine and my mama's cooking, and the candles she put on the mantle that she had been buying from the same store on Charlotte Pike since before I was born. Donna had made everything that Christmas required in her kitchen, and the table was the way it always was. The good dishes and the cloth napkins, and my daddy at the head of it saying grace with that voice of his that I had been hearing say grace for 29 years and which still had the quality of something worth stopping for. It was different, and it was the same. The same in the way that the food and the dishes and the grace and my mama's candles were the same. Different in the way that I was different. Sitting at that table in the Bellevue house as myself in a way that I had not quite been before, without the managed version of me that had occupied that chair for years, the version that kept certain things below the surface of the conversation and smiled in the right places and left no edges showing. The edges were there now. My daddy knew they were there. My mama knew they were there, and the table held all of us anyway, which was the thing that mattered. After dinner, my daddy and I did the dishes together the way we had when I was a child, he washing and me drying, a division of labor so old it required no discussion. We stood at the kitchen sink in the Bellevue house with the sounds of Christmas coming from the living room where Donna was watching something on television, and he washed the good dishes with the careful attention he gave to things that could break, and we talked about ordinary things for a while. His church renovation, a book he had been reading, a trip he and Donna were thinking about taking in the spring. Then he handed me a serving dish and said without looking up from the sink, "I have been reading some things, trying to understand better." I dried the serving dish and set it on the counter. I said, "I know, Daddy." He said, "I am not all the way there yet." I said, "I know that too." He handed me the next dish. He said, "I want to get there. That matters to me." I said, "It matters to me too." He nodded once, the specific nod he had for things that were decided rather than things that were discussed. And we finished the dishes in the quiet of the Bellevue kitchen with the Christmas sounds coming from the other room and the December Nashville night on the other side of the window above the sink. I drove to Holly Street after leaving my parents' house, arriving at 9:30 with a container of my mama's cooking that she had pressed into my hands at the door with the specific Donna force that was not optional. Chloe opened the door in the particular way she opened the door when she had been expecting me, with the unhurried ease of someone who is not performing welcome because the welcome is just the state of things. She was wearing a large, soft sweater that looked like it had been chosen for maximum comfort rather than any other consideration, and her hair was loose, and she had a pencil behind her ear that she had clearly forgotten about. George the houseplant was wearing a small ribbon that Jamie had brought over earlier in the week, and which Chloe had left on because she could not bring herself to take it off. Sandra came over at 10, and the three of us sat in the Holly Street living room with Donna's food and tea, and the particular ease of people who have arrived at a way of being together that does not require effort to maintain. Sandra had brought us sweet potato pie that she set on the kitchen counter with the authority of someone depositing something important, and which was, when we got to it later, the best sweet potato pie I had ever eaten in my life, including my mama's, a fact I kept to myself for reasons of family loyalty. We talked until midnight, with the easy-ranging quality of a conversation that has nowhere it needs to get to and covers everything as a result. After Sandra left, Chloe and I sat on the Holly Street couch in the quiet of the Christmas Eve midnight, the small lights she had strung along the window frame casting a warm glow over the room, the drawings on the walls visible in the low light, George with his ribbon in the corner. She had her sketchbook open but was not drawing, just holding it in her lap the way she held it when she was thinking rather than working. I was leaning against her shoulder in the way I had learned fit exactly right, and which she had learned to accommodate without shifting. The particular physical grammar of two people who have been next to each other long enough to know the language of it. She said, "What are you thinking about?" I thought about it honestly, which was the only way she ever asked and the only way I ever answered. I said, "July." She said, "The parking garage or the phone?" I said, "The phone. The specific moment I walked back into the theater, and you were standing there." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I had been working at that cinema for 2 years. I had done the post-show walkthrough of that theater 140 times probably. I found things people left behind all the time." I said, "But," she said, "but I had never stood at the door holding something waiting for the person to come back." I said, "Why that time?" She said, "Because of the case. The photo on the case. Something about the way she was smiling in that photograph." She paused. "I wanted to hand it back to someone smiling like that and see what happened." I said, "What happened?" She turned and looked at me in the Christmas Eve lamplight with that uncontained smile, the real one, the one she had stopped managing around me so long ago that I could not remember the last time I had seen her try to hold it back. She said, "Everything." New Year's Eve we spent at a party in the Gulch at the gallery where the show had been, the gallerist having decided that the space was too good not to use for the occasion. The white walls still marked with the ghost rectangles of where the work had hung now hung instead with lights, and the particular beautiful noise of Nashville creative people on the last night of 2019. Jamie was there in a sequined jacket that she had described as restrained, and which was the opposite of restrained, and which was completely correct for the occasion. Sandra came for the first hour and left at 11 because she had work the next morning, and had made her peace with this fact about herself years ago. Donna texted at 11:45 to say Happy Almost New Year, which was the most technologically forward thing she had done in recent memory, and which I showed to Chloe, who said, "Your mama is trying." I said, "She really is." At midnight, the room counted down the way rooms count down on New Year's Eve, with the collective noise of people agreeing to mark the moment together. And when the count reached 0 and 2020 began, Chloe turned to me in the middle of the gallery noise and kissed me with the ease of something that has found its place and knows it, unhurried and warm and present, and I kissed her back with the same ease, and around us the gallery celebrated the arrival of a new year, and we were entirely in it, and entirely in our own world at the same time, which is the particular gift of being with someone in whom the two things are not in conflict. Walking out of the gallery into the gulch at 12:30 in the morning, the Nashville New Year's Eve. Cold was sharp and clean, and the sky above the city was clear, the way it gets on cold, dry December nights. More stars visible than the city usually allowed. The light pollution reduced by the cold clarity of the air. We walked without a destination the way we had learned to walk, taking the streets as they came, the cobblestone blocks near the gallery and the wider avenues beyond. The city quiet now in the way it gets after midnight on a holiday when the celebrating has moved inside. She stopped on a corner and looked up at the Nashville sky for a moment, that gesture of hers that I had come to recognize as the one she made when something was large enough to require the whole of the available space. I stopped beside her and looked up too. The stars above Nashville on the first morning of 2020 were doing what Chloe's drawings did, which was holding something still long enough to be seen. I looked at them for a moment, and then I looked at her, looking at them. This woman who had been holding my lost phone in a movie theater corridor 6 months ago, and who had handed it back carefully because she understood it mattered, and who had been keeping things carefully ever since, who had drawn our whole story in a sketchbook that now sat on a Holly Street coffee table as the most honest record of a year I would ever have access to. She lowered her eyes from the sky and found me looking at her and did not look away. She said, "What?" I said, "Nothing. Everything." She looked at me for a moment with those eyes that had been paying full attention to me since July, and which I had stopped finding disarming because I had started finding them necessary. And then she smiled. That uncontained real smile that I had decided sometime in August was one of the best things I had ever seen on another person's face, and which had not lost that quality in any of the months since. She took my hand, and we kept walking. The Nashville New Year night around us. The city beginning its first hours of a new decade. The cold and the quiet, and the stars above the gulch doing their patient work of being beautiful, whether anyone was looking or not. My name is Maya. I am 29 years old, and I live in Nashville, Tennessee, and on the 12th of July of 2019, I left my phone between the seats of a movie theater at the Opry Mills Mall, and a woman with a purple iris tattoo on her wrist picked it up and held it carefully and waited for me to come back for it. I did not know then that I was also coming back for everything else. I know now. I would not change a single step of the road that brought me to a Holly Street couch in December, with a sketchbook on the coffee table and a houseplant with a ribbon in the corner, and a woman beside me who has been drawing the truth of things since before either of us had the words for what the truth was. Some things you lose on purpose without knowing you are doing it. Some things you find the same way. The best things in my life have arrived not when I was looking for them, but when I finally stopped looking for something else. The end.